All right. All right. Looks like everybody's in. There's a lot of pressure with like a VIP section. It's kind of weird. I've never been at a talk with a VIP section. I don't know. I have like separate badges or something to be able to sit there. But my name is Bill Lampe. I'm out of Columbus, Ohio, so not from Michigan, but I'm up here quite a bit. I do like West Michigan, especially Grand Rapids, very fun city, so appreciate you having me in. I'm going to talk about some SIEM trends in the market, some of my background, so you know why I'm here talking to you, to give you some of this. I have multiple certifications, degrees. I was a network admin for a while, like junior network admin for about 2 years. Then I spent 9 years as security architect at a Fortune 500 company. And then for about the past 6 years, I've been a partner reseller. This is not my company presentation. I didn't want to kind of throw it on, but I work for Optiv. And I've been there for about 6 years, 4 years as a pre-sales engineer, and about 1.5 years as a director managing a team. So with that perspective, I kind of have talked to a lot of customers, been out in the field, and that's kind of where I gathered this data. It's not really research data. It's really Bill Lampe's opinion of what SIEM looks like in Michigan, Ohio, Western PA, Indiana. So no Poneman Institute stats or anything like that. It's all kind of out of my brain. So cool. So this is not a hacker presentation. You know, when I was asked to do this, I was like, okay, I kind of more on the other side of the house. So I know there was a 4 at the end of the presentation name out there. I don't know if that makes me a little more elite or something, but this is definitely more of a business-focused presentation talking specifically about SIEM. More on the blue team, really trying to talk about the prevent, detect, respond piece of the game. And I'm staying away from vendors. You know, I'm a big technologist. I'll talk vendors all day and different cool things they're doing, and see me in the hall, please feel free to pull me aside and talk to me, but I'm really going to keep more concept, right? Features, new things that we're, you know, seeing out there that I'm seeing. And I do want to say, I apologize, I'm not a marketer. I'm horrible at making PowerPoints, so I tried to make it simple. I feel like I'm letting everybody down because I saw some presentations that were very slick in marketing, and that's just not the way I roll. And looking more to kind of educate and talk and go through some of this stuff. So any of the pictures may be a little generic and a little bit like, okay, what's in the free copyrighted pictures of a lock or security that I could use in this presentation. So SIEM, right? Let's set the table. What are we talking about when we're talking about SIEM? We're talking about security information and event management. SIEM, you know, however you decide to pronounce it. I've heard people passionately say SIEM, heard people say SIM. It doesn't matter to me. You know, it really combines two practices of trying to go after events and going after information in your environment, trying to marry them together to try and understand what's going on in your environment, aggregating these multiple data points to be able to identify these deviations happening in your network. You know, they're really rules-based engines, looking at risk, making reporting. You may have to do SIEM today when it comes to forensics, understanding what's happening in your environment. You know, I started getting into SIEM because of lovely compliance PCI when I worked at that Fortune 500, right? That's where we kind of moved from syslog NG to a real SIEM that has a rule-based type engine. You know, I'm sure if some of you have to go through the fun thing of compliance. Also, from a forensics perspective, being to go back and understand what's happening in the network. Triage. And again, these are just some concepts I want to kind of set the table so you know where we're coming from when I talk through some of these different observations. So in the medical community, right, triage is being able to understand urgency in an ER or in some emergency situation to be able to bring in and decide who gets treated first, right? You know, we've taken that as IT, incident response people, in the business perspective, to be able to start say, okay, let's look at our events in our environment and let's try and go through and understand what's our order of response for these large amounts of events coming from these large amounts of log sources, right? So that whole process is how we're triaging, right? Gathering evidence, going through and really facilitating that process of taking an event in your network to a full incident, right? Because anything showing up in your SIEM could potentially be an incident. So you have to make sure you're properly triaging when you're doing this. A lot of solutions today, which I'll dig in more, is really around automation. I know there's been some talks here talking about the whole security orchestration automation space, but that's really what a lot of these different products are going to, and that's purely because there's not enough talent. There's really not enough of us in the industry, which is good for us, right, when it comes to trying to make money and negotiation or, you know, going around if you're a smart security person. But these tool sets are just not enough, right? So there's a couple things happening, you know, to push us along when it comes to triage. Security analytics, you know, I get frustrated a bit in the industry when we really turn things into marketing terms, right? I think there's a lot of vendors out there putting out a lot of noise, a lot of fuzziness. They'll name their products certain things to carry on traditional concepts, right? And they confuse the market. But I want to make sure I kind of defined what, you know, we're looking at when we're saying security analytics. That's really looking at the enrichment of our data. You know, adding analytics to our data means we're adding more context. We're adding different understandings of what our data looks like on our network from multiple different sources at scale, right? That's what some of these systems are really going to give us. The other concept is data science that I'll be talking about. So again, I get frustrated and I don't go to RSA more because I think it's kind of waste and too many vendors, but I feel like they always put up, you know, data science, machine learning, all these, you know, more academic type terms to try and confuse the market. But aside from that, so data science, you know, it's deriving insight from our data. You know, what can we do to mine through our data to find different patterns, understand what's normal? How do we do it at scale? How do we do it that's so static? How do we use statistical analysis and other things to help us churn through data very fast? Because there's a talent issue, there's a disparate source issue. A lot of things take us down the path of data science. The data scientist is a very growing field in the space overall, right? I know specifically when it comes to marketing, which I'll touch on, when it comes to security, you know, that's a big thing. We're seeing a lot of insurance companies hire a bunch of data scientists. I'll get into that, talking about data lakes and some other types of trends. So those are some of the concepts I just want to kind of set the table. So what is the current state of SIEM, right? Not fully deployed solutions, right? That's a problem. Talking to customers, going out there, understanding, okay, there's this talent issue, there's these not fully deployed systems, not fully invested as they should, you know, not enough money to deploy that phase 2, right? You as a customer going in, using all these use cases, making all this justification, all this documentation, and then you're like, oh, well, we got to shave it down. We're not actually going to fully deploy it to phase 2. Cut to 2 to 3 years later, you're in that same cycle again. Well, maybe it's not this. Maybe it's this other vendor. Let's go to this other vendor trying to help us. So it's just this thing that just keeps happening over and over again with SIEM that it's very expensive, right? You're spending lots of money on it. You're not getting the value you need, right? So there's the issue in the marketplace that a couple different things I'll talk through that some ways to approach it. You know, is that ROI checking out? Are you finding those events that are turning into incidents in your network? Are you finding it? Are you having your kind of more junior analysts being able to churn through complex data sets like that and be able to articulate some high-level advanced things to be able to triage it properly? I don't know. And really, when you try to look at SIEM, I try and look at a couple different things, right? What's the average time to be able to, you know, find an incident? You know, the mean time to detect. What's the average time to respond to it? And, even it's just, what's the average time to value? And that's kind of the bigger thing that's been noticed, at least, when I talk about talking to customers and seeing kind of in the marketplace what's happening. So really those are some big metrics that I would look at. And really, is SIEM as we know it a failure, right? It's a hard conversation with customers and with everybody, because there's some people where it's like, you're calling my baby ugly. I've done SIEM log management for 15 years, right? And maybe it's not the right way. And that's kind of what going through here, just some different ways to approach it. And it's a hard conversation. And I've seen more newer people in security buck on some of these trends that are happening out there. But some, they're like, oh, this is my job. This is what I'm used to. I'm used to going in, doing these static correlations. I'm used to going in, and this is what I do. And you're turning my world upside down. So looking a little bit at the history of SIEM, I kind of look at, SIEM 1.0 was kind of a log manager, right? Really looking at, and we spent a lot of money on those filters, right? I mean, now it's a lot easier, regex, right, all that. But then you just pour lots of money into these filters. Wasn't very scalable, very strictly security logs, using grep. Grep's your friend. Then we got into this SIEM 2.0. We're like, okay, this is going to solve our problem. The SIEM's a very important part of our security plan, articulating our security posture, articulating to management what proper metrics we have and need. And we said, okay, SIEM 2.0, that's going to do it. You had some vendors come on the scene, and they really helped with that correlation of those security logs. They helped give more context by looking at vulnerability data, by looking at Netflow data, looking at what's going on in the network to help you be able to take a more risk-based type approach when looking at your security posture. And providing you some IR triage, some basic IR triage within their platforms. You really spent a lot of money on the correlations when it comes there. And still do. That's a big part of the budget, are these static correlations that you're spending money on, right? The SIEM 1.0, you spend on the log filters. Now SIEM kind of 2.0, you're spending a lot on, how do I get my correlations? Oh, I got this new log source. Because your environment's always changing. You're always getting new applications rolled up. Should you be consuming your web logs? Should you not? Do you have enough storage? There's just a lot of things out there that make SIEM a pretty messy space. And they have structured searching, very formatted structured searching, where maybe unstructured has a better play, right? So what are we looking at now? What is it? SIEM 3.0, next gen SIEM. I don't know. I'm not a marketing guy, as I kind of told everybody as they stood up here. Looking at full packets. Let's look at the full packet. How can we make it consumable from a cost perspective for everyone to see the full payload? Let's set to the side the SSL conversation, because that definitely is a larger conversation, right, as everyone's looking at their network and talking about looking at full packet capture. But let's give some context. Look at the payload. Let's look at where our packets are going. How about adding in an enterprise logging layer? And I'm not talking about a data lake. I'm talking about, more, what other use cases can we find for SIEM to help us? Moving into the cloud, right? We need to not spend our time maintaining things, right? We don't want to spend our time making sure the event collector is up and making sure the software is patched a certain way, right? We want to be in there. We want to be threat hunting. We want to be going after that triage process. We want to be finding things that are interesting and cool on our network and be able to move our data around in interesting ways, right? A lot of managed security services, going into MSS, having some first set of eyes on our data, someone looking at it that we don't have the staff, and being able to provide some value to us. Some easy point and click searching, so with that talent issue again, going through and being able to articulate complex data sets in meaningful ways with maybe junior analysts that need a lot of hand-holding to be able to present it, but helps you with that talent issue, right? And then the whole triage process is kind of big things, right? With the orchestration, automation, and I'll kind of dig into all these topics. Analytics, again, as we kind of covered before, How can we enrich our data more? How can we make it more valuable to us in the organization? User behavior analytics, user entity behavior analytics, they've came on the scene a couple years ago, and that they've really kind of shook in the SIEM market, in my opinion. Data science-based correlations, going back to how can we move quicker, how can we find data faster, how can we find issues on our network faster with not large staff. Digital transformation projects, I'll kind of talk through this, and taking budget, and some of the bigger projects I've seen in the region have really been ones that have tied on to digital transformation projects and organizations where their budget is way bigger than even the security's budget to do business as they transform their business and latching onto that. The MITRE attack framework. So as security people, this is a really great framework to be able to understand the life cycle of attack. So definitely research it. I'll talk about it in a couple slides, but definitely something should be on your list to look through. A more consumable cost. So with SIEM, there's a lot of different cost models. There's some newer players on the scene that are really providing per user-based cost, and maybe not per log source or per correlation or per action. There's just some new consumable costs that may make it easier for you to get that full phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 approach when looking at SIEM. And then looking at machine learning for anomaly detection and triage. So how can we best use these statistical analysis and things at our disposal, especially when you start looking at cloud-based infrastructure and not having to have all this big processing on-prem to be able to do some of this. So I'll dig in here. Netflow and packet capture. So, Netflow, packet capture have been around for a while. I'm a big believer that should be in your SIEM. I'm a believer you need that data. You need to understand what's happening at the network layer. But what's really changed, over time, right? So I think it's a lot more advanced correlation of the data. It's a lot more context to the data than it was previously. The ability to present that data in a consumable feedback. It's really kind of interesting. There's some, vendors out there hiring Hollywood studios to present the data. That they've gone out and said, okay, that cool hackers movie did all the GUI-based hacking, and that really resonated with people. So they're hiring those studios to make their interfaces to say, okay, let's not make this boring static interface. Let's hire somebody. Or even virtual reality, right? And that really reminds me of the movie Hackers. That's what that screenshot. Going through the whole mainframe and everything. So that they're really virtual reality, trying to attract talent, trying to say, oh, okay, you can get people to work for you. Use virtual reality to try and go through this data. So interesting things happening. And then obviously data science and analytics as part of packet capture. This really enterprise logging layer, it's kind of come on the scene. And again, it's not a data lake, something kind of separate. But, it's come as a way, as maybe their use cases has expanded outside of security. Maybe you have some operational based use cases that are not fully in security, and due to licensing costs, it's better to add this kind of layer in front of your SIEM and then pick and choose what things are going to be passed on to the next layer. Maybe from a marketing perspective, and this does tie in, data lakes down the line, you need to be able to get an analytics engine. Your marketing team wants to understand and consume some of those web logs, consume and understand, where people are clicking from geographically. How do you kind of correlate that all together? Is that a security problem? Is it an operations problem? Digital transformation? All part of it. And then you roll into IT operations, and you're looking at, is it card swipe? Is that physical security moving over to security? Right, that's another pretty big trend that's happening, it seems, in the marketplaces. More and more security organizations are getting in charge of physical security in addition to kind of the more logical traditional security as we know. Or even temperature sensors, availability of our data centers, if we're having data centers, right, with everyone moving to the cloud. If you're rolling up a new application, you should not be building a data center, right? That's kind of the new, easier way to build scalable applications. And then license cost savings, right? So maybe they only are having so much EPS or MPS that they have license for from a SIEM perspective that they need to tone it down with some layer that's shimming in the middle. I want to throw this up there because I think as security people, it's important to understand this because there's a lot of issues in the market, as I've seen, with cloud in general. And really, you can look at the basics of this model as, okay, if I'm going cloud, what does that mean? And how does this fit into SIEM? I'll talk about, and that's purely the cloud-based infrastructure. But there's so many people that don't fully understand what these different models mean that are going to cloud, that you need to know it, you need to live it, you need to know that you are in charge of security at every one of these models. But kind of easy blocking and tackling, I highly recommend you kind of get familiarized with this, know what the implication is on your network, on security in your role, because cloud is coming, and it's coming very fast, because it's cheaper, and they have really cool tools. If you played with AWS and Azure, getting a little bit off topic, but they have really cool tools, right? So this gets further confused when you have vendors out there in the marketplace calling something SaaS that's maybe platform, or calling something platform that's really infrastructure, that's managed, that adds a layer of complexity. It's just you got to dig in when you're looking at some of these solutions. And that's kind of where I say you got to get to the blocking and tackling and get through the marketing fluff of different people you're talking to and looking at organizations like the Cloud Security Alliance and some others to be able to understand frameworks and what you're doing in cloud, and there's some NIST stuff out there as well. So I think that's important because I am going to talk about cloud. I know it's like, why did you go on this cloud rant? But so cloud-based infrastructure, that's definitely a newer trend. And don't pay attention to the vendors. I just typed in SIEM in the AWS marketplace. Not saying any of those vendors, positive, negative, or whatever. They're just the ones that came up. But more and more customers looking at, okay, let's not utilize on-prem equipment. Let's use these cloud-based infrastructure. Let's look at it from a storage perspective. Let's look at scalability, reliability, right? I mean, there's a major cost in doing this, but they're going to give you more scale, more reliability than you can have. And you can just install within your VPC, within the cloud environment or virtual network, depending if you're an AWS or Azure shop. And it's important to note, hosted SIEM is not infrastructure as service, right? An organization managing it, is not that. This whole SaaS SIEM, I think this is a big part of where everyone is moving to. And if you're not cloud adverse as an organization, this definitely has a lot more positives, when you're looking at SIEM and looking at log management. No need for a lot of care and feeding on the back end, looking at SIEM as a service, security as a service, whatever you want to talk and say. It's not a hosted SIEM. It's not a SaaS log management. You don't have to worry about deploying the technology components. You're just paying a more subscription cost, which that may start to get into a CapEx versus OpEx type conversation. But that's really where everything is moving to. It seems to at very rapid pace, right? If you look at your organization and look at more subscription-based, more utility consume, that has its positives and negatives, right? You're always billed without a buffer of exactly what you use when you move more SaaS-based and cloud-based, right? Even down to the second at some when you start talking about cloud. But that does open you up freedom-wise, to go. There is MSS, Managed Security Service, out there, right? I struggle with this personally. I feel like there's it's going to give you that first level, that 24 hours eyes on glass, but are they going to provide you the value you're looking for? Do you have misaligned expectations? There's so many customers that really are not aligned expectation-wise when it comes to MSS. They think that there's going to be someone dedicated and teams of people for a very, very low cost, and that's just not true. It's really hey, I'm going to help you find the stuff, easy blocking and tackling first level stuff when it comes to MSS. I'm going to help you correlate threat data and share threat data out there. It can help you check a box, but you know, I've seen so many customers go from one to another because they were expecting something different. They were expecting maybe what some of these more next-gen MSSs are starting to provide, which is a mixture of orchestration and staff augmentation and dedicated people, because MSS is never, they're going to go down your triage tree, your hierarchy tree that you set out, but they're not going to be enabled in your business to be able to go start contacting people and do things on your behalf as a security organization. Meaning, there's an alert in the middle of the night, they're going to call and pass it over to you. IR triage, so looking really at that security orchestration automation, I think this is absolutely part of SIEM. You know, you've seen some vendors in the space that have proven that out. Yeah, that makes sense. It is supposed to be part of this whole one-stop shop for what's going on our network and what we're doing. So, you know, we're trying to clean up that IR process as part of this, make it a little more cleaner. How can we add in, you know, easy vetting to these different events when it comes to threat intelligence, when it comes to saying this event is more important to look at than this one. And that can be either a manual type framework to follow that's a little more compliance heavy with human processes happening, or that could be, you know, something that's running scripts and talking via APIs to all these multiple things with different types of cookbooks and whatnot of how to respond. So the big thing is, okay, how do you have this off-network cloud SIEM talking and be able to do this on network? Some of that stuff is not fully fleshed out. There's still going to be some on-prem equipment needed, but it's definitely kind of where the market's going. So I kind of sum up and say, okay, my SIEM 1.0, 2.0, that was meantime kind of to detect. SIEM 3.0 or next-gen SIEM, whatever you want to call it, I think that's really what's the meantime to respond in automated fashion or manually. We'll talk a little about UEBA, right? So I think that's really hard to be able to detect insider threats on our network just using these static correlations, right? If we look at what I kind of talked through SIEM 1.0, 2.0, it's these static correlations that say A plus B equals alert that you need to go take a look at and do something. Where this whole using analytics, using data science, we could tell you what's normal on the network. What's normal user behavior? Let's baseline it. Let's look for deviations outside the norm. Let's put people on watch lists, and let's do that at scale. And that at scale piece is the big part of UEBA, because you can make these static correlations, but they're not going to scale, and you're going to go crazy trying to make those static correlations. There's some now coming out that's more SaaS based, right? More bring your own infrastructure. I think, you know, Amazon even purchased the UEBA vendor. But it's really kind of getting in the whole space, I think, shown that there was quite a bit of alert fatigue in SIEM. Some of the issues that I've talked about with traditional SIEMs, or SIEM in general, it's kind of, you know, I think UEBA came on the space and kind of said, hey, you can have things better. You can have a new pricing model that's maybe by entity or by user that's not by log source and amount of volume. You know, you can be more use case driven rather than log source driven. You know, understand what you're trying to get at, how you're trying to articulate data. How can we look at entities on our network, things misbehaving outside the norm, and let's make a Fisher-Price type interface to be able to go through for our junior analysts and articulate data, because we can't have our higher level analysts being able to dig into every one of those events. They're that are going to be on the other side, hopefully, from an IR perspective, from understanding when there are incidents in our network. So data science-based correlations. So, right, we had the traditional kind of static correlations that really don't scale well, that have taken, as I'd mentioned, a lot of money, a lot of services dollars, a lot of time that people have, and trying to say, okay, let's add science to the mix and make it a little easier for everybody. With the cloud models, you know, you definitely can say that you can be able to do processing faster and more at speed without having the on-prem infrastructure on your network. Definitely makes that whole bring your own data scientist, if you have data scientists on staff, or kind of rent some from organizations. Because data scientists, I don't know, as I mentioned before, it's a very growing field where there's a lot of money being thrown back and forth at people. But really, the ability to churn through these complex logs, you know, because if you look at something like simple as Windows, right? Windows Event Manager, it all depends on what things are grabbing that log to be able to, you know, send it over on whatever format. There's not a lot of standards there. So how do you do that at scale without having to create all these different parser rules? We have this thing called data lakes, right? So marketing, a little bit out there, but it is a big growing thing happening in kind of the data world, in the SIEM world. Not every organization needs a data lake, right? You know, maybe you don't have the use cases to justify it. Maybe it's outside of security, right? So try and make sure it's what you need. You know, what do we use this data lake for? It's really this big central repository for a lot of data, right? They use, if you think about when Google came on the scene, how did they go out and be able to index the internet? Right? They had to look at all these different types of file types, all these different types of things that were not standardized. So how they do it? Then they had to use this other concepts out there, MongoDB, AppR, NoSQL. They will go and bring and store all this different types of data. It's really not going to be used for quick and easy searches, not for clean data. A lot of dirty data where we're just throwing it up in this big blob that you're really going to, when you read it, as you're mining the data, is when you start forming it and structuring it in data. But it is really impacting us as security people because we're starting to get, and I'll talk about some digital transformation projects, but really starting to get thrown from a marketing perspective in the industry, you know, just in general, hey, what's this data lake stuff? How do we do it? Do we need it? Do we need to throw all of our data here in this repository that has all this raw data in it? Or maybe we don't. Maybe you don't have the business use cases of a marketing team or whatever else is out there to be able to go through and churn through this data and understand what the data means. So for example, if we're looking at, from a marketing perspective, like some sort of focused marketing event, be able to take, you know, someone liked some golf course on Facebook, right? And then taking another point of signed up for an email mailing list, signed up for, lives in a certain area, not signed up, but has bought this brand, and kind of churning through that data to say, okay, let's automatically send them a coupon. Why does that matter to you in security professionals? Because you could tie into these projects. The data lakes, I'm sure, are getting more and more part of your conversation and things you're being asked. But again, I'll go back to my point. You may not need a data lake. Don't get confused with the hype. Data lakes kind of sit on top of SIEMs, and they help orchestrate. And it's a lot of custom work with a lot of tools out there. I'd mentioned digital transformation a couple of times. So really that's how do we use technology to help expand and change how we do business, right? There's a lot of reasons you should care, right? Tie your budget to that. I've seen a lot of projects where customer has a SIEM project, they're trying to add screens to all of their fuel pumps, and all of a sudden a lot more budget for SIEM appears as they try and churn through and understand what is our data strategy, how do we tie to it, how do we make sure it's secure, how do we make sure we're addressing the risk that comes with doing digital transformation. But important to look, especially with bigger things like SIEM. The MITRE attack framework, again, very important as security professionals. You're starting to understand this. It's really trying to break down the attacks. I think MITRE is even going out and doing evaluation of endpoint solutions and how they break down within this framework. But very good framework to be able to talk about how does an adversary launch attacks within our network. You know, have 11 different stages of it. How do we articulate how this attack happened? How do we make it understandable and consumable for everyone? A big part of this is that SIEMs are adding this in, right? So that's one kind of trend we're seeing is that people are adding it in to their product sets. That's why I bring it up. So what does the future look like, right? In my opinion, I think it's something SaaS or managed, better metrics, more tied to the business, really trying to increase our mean time to attack, mean time to respond. How do we automate as we can? as we become more trusting of the whole automation space, right? As IT people, automation has been around since the 90s or before. But I feel like as security people, we're a little late to the game to actually implementing it because of a trust issue and whatnot. But because of our talent gap, we have to be able to start embracing it, especially for, low-level type tasks within our SIEM. Facilitate turning that event into an incident. No more fail phase 2, as I mentioned, trying to do that with cloud infrastructure, better pricing, no more static correlations, moving away from that. Reduce complexity, address the talent gap, because that does impact organizations, especially when we're talking about SIEM. There's people talking about SIEM as a utility, so, more kind of SaaS type services and really getting you from how can I go after my events rather than worry about the infrastructure of it itself. Data scientists and just better understanding of happening in the network. So that's my kind of view of the world and what I've observed. I hope it was helpful and talked about some things that was interesting, but I will take some questions. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, how do we, we're definitely seeing people go down the path of the elk, right? And obviously that is a lot of manual efforts, a lot of services you have to do because there's not things that you just buy to turn it into a SIEM. There's the X-Packs, security X-Packs and whatnot, and they'll give you some good searching and whatnot, but it won't turn it into a SIEM. So yeah, we are seeing some, it depends on the strategy, right? When we talked about data lakes, do they have a data lake strategy? Does it make sense? You get what you pay for, right? Like when you start going the open source route, you start doing things on your own, piggybacking it. There's a cost there, whether it's no throat to choke at the end of the day if you're looking for patch or whatnot, or resources to stand it up versus buying things off the box and whatnot. It's a mixture of both, and it depends on the strategy of what someone's looking at. There's a back there. Oh, sorry. He was asking, what do I see more customers doing DIY with like an elk stack, or buying something kind of off the shelf with prepackaged correlations and everything. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it gets harder with some things like flat files, right, or event logs in different places that you need to probably put some sort of agent to be able to be the facility. That's a lot where some of the more commercialized products in the SIEM space do a good job, where they can have a little more intelligent agent that can sit in a certain spot on your network, maybe closed off, or start doing some things like caching or encrypting between the SIEM and the agent, store and forward. So it really depends on the log sources that somebody has and how to address the solution. Snare or whatever else is out there for some of those, or obviously every SIEM has their own agent. And that's definitely a bigger part of conversations is what's your architecture of log aggregation? Do you need some sort of load balancer so you have one IP that you're using for all of your logs, no matter where you are globally, things like that. There's another question. Over there. Sorry, I missed the end. Yeah, that's not a good way to go at it. So really, it's look at, okay, what do you have compliance-wise to do, right? That's the first step. And that's even looking at these next-gen solutions. Maybe you do just a UBA solution as your SIEM, and then from a forensic compliance perspective, stick an enterprise logging layer there with something, right? But go through and understand, what do you have to do from a compliance perspective? What are your risk assets, right? You kind of look at what's the DMZ, what's talking, what's holding intellectual property, obviously user data, and kind of weigh down from a risk perspective from log sources. Also run through your use cases that you're looking for, but I wouldn't recommend logging everything, right? There's just some things a SIEM are not made for. Operational based logs, things like that. There are better tools to consume and articulate that data. And that's where it gets really fuzzy, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen that work. Get the eyes on glass 24/7, or even nighttime, 5 to 7. We'll see them augment and try and supplement, and then kind of take it on their own with their own deployed solution. I think I'd caution more when it comes to managed services, make sure that at the end of the day, you can take your data and what does that offloading look like, right? That's a big challenge. Are you using some sort of proprietary system? Are you using something that's off the shelf that they're managing? And what does the offload look like? Do you get to keep it at the end, or are they going to give you just some tar file of logs that's petabytes big that's useless to you if you actually had to go back and do forensics on it? All right, well, I appreciate everyone's time, and that's all I got. So.